pages educational video that I had to do for an assignment. This is not available for that. I'm just gonna go over what I'm gonna talk about. I'm gonna talk about how the resting membrane potential is established. I'm gonna talk about the properties and characteristics of the resting membrane potential, events that happen during an action potential, the differences between graded potentials and action potentials, and then the capacitance and length constant, and then how myelin affects those two things. So to start, I'm going to talk about the resting and then usually when we write this out, we reference it as just the RMP. So the resting membrane potential just talks about the charge that is on the inside of the cell. So if this is a cell, and this is the extracellular fluid, and this is the intracellular fluid, it's going to be more negative on the inside of the cell, and that means that it's more positive on the outside of the cell. And this is due to mainly sodium being on the outside and potassium being on the inside, but they're both positive charges, and they both also have chloride attached to them, which is negative. It just depends on something we call gradients, analogical gradients, and so there's going to be a lot more sodium on the outside of the cell, and then a lot more potassium on the inside of the cell. But that also means that there's like a little bit of each in their non-respective areas, and so the Na just has more positive charge, and so then that makes this inside very negative and very positive. This is very important because it determines how action potentials are propagated, and depending on what kind of cell we're talking about, it has different kinds of action potentials and different threshold amounts. Okay. That's all about resting membrane potential. The one we talk about most often is neurons, like at the -70, and so I'll probably reference that later. But every cell has a different threshold amount, which means like it takes different amounts of work for different cells to work, which is also important. But oh, the properties of a cell. I'm just gonna call this the cell wall again. This is the outside, so it's more positive. This is the inside, so there's lots of it, and then a little bit of K, and then lots of potassium, and then a little bit of sodium. And so this is what we call the lipid bilayer of the cell. It is very selective as to what gets to go through this membrane, and that is very important, especially when we're talking about resting membrane potential. And so we have leak channels, which are just always open. They're just holes in the membrane, and the ones that are most common found on cells is a potassium leak channel. And so potassium can leave or come in whenever it wants, and this helps establish that negativeness in the inside of the cell. However, there are times when we do need to move sodium inside of the cell, and that's why we have, they're called sodium and potassium pumps. So for every 3 sodiums we bring in to the cell, 2 potassiums can leave. And so this is how we control the electronegativity of the inside, because this is a facilitated diffusion. We need ATP in order for this to work. So this is like prevents molecules from just moving willy-nilly, because there is a lower amount of potassium on the inside. It wants to go outside, but no, opposite. Because there's a little bit in here, potassium wants to come inside the cell, but we don't always necessarily want potassium to come inside the cell. And so it's very important that we can control this, like in an efficient way, because if we didn't, then there wouldn't be a charge on the outside of the cell, which is not good, because we need action potentials. So keep all of this in mind, but I'm gonna erase it.
Fun fact, I had a burp that whole time.
That's epic.
Yeah.
Can I keep going on?
Huh?
Can I keep going on? Are you done?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel so restless.
Okay, next I'm going to talk about what conditions can change the resting membrane potential conditions and why things sometimes move more aggressively than other times. So there's two different equations I want to talk about. There's the Nernst equation, which talks about EX, and then there's also driving force, which tells you where a certain molecule wants to move based on electricity, basically. And so we have the Nernst equation, which is EX equals negative 61.5 over Z, and then Z is the charge of the molecule. So for example, if you were trying to find this for sodium, it would just be +1. Or if you were trying to do calcium, it'd be +2. Or if you try to do chloride, it'd be -1. And so whichever, like whatever script you're adding to your little particle, that's what your Z is going to be. And then this is X is XI. Yep. XI and XO. So this is, I think that's our O, and then there's a log right here. So these X's are the concentration of whatever you're measuring going in, and then this X is the concentration of whatever you're measuring going out of the cell. And so, like if we were to do potassium, like the Z would be +1, and then this would be like the concentration of potassium going inside the cell, and then the concentration of potassium going outside of the cell. And so this is just like a mathematical way to show where things are moving, basically. But it's important to find EX because we need EX for the driving force equation. And so I'm going to abbreviate as DF, which equals EX minus, no, it's VM. EX. And so this is how you find why things are moving across the bilayer, or why things they're not, or why they're doing it so aggressively or not as aggressively. And it's just because of like the voltage and how much is moving there and the gradients and stuff. The next thing I'm going to go over is the events that happen during an action potential. So an action potential is just, to put it in terms of my own words, is the movement of electricity in a cell, specifically a neuron, electricity down a neuron that makes something happen. And so this is where like the sodium and potassium pumps and channels really come in handy, because then you can really control the movement of the electricity, or what we were talking about in class, we called it the boing. Funny. But we can see this on a chart of electricity. So this is a chart, this is time, this is voltage. That looks like an X, voltage. I'm just going to reference the -70 it's actually millivolts. So this is the resting membrane potential, so the lipid bilayer that I was talking about earlier. And so when your cell isn't doing anything, it's just chilling at this moment. It's just there, right? But your body's like, yo, something needs to happen. I don't want to die. But we have this line, which might be 55 millivolts, maybe 55, which is called your threshold. And if you cannot get the membrane potential to be 55, then nothing is going to happen, because action potentials are an all or nothing event. And so what happens is your body is like, hey, something needs to happen. I'm going to open my sodium channels, and when sodium rushes into the cell, it gets more positive. And so it goes up. And then once it hits threshold, it's like, yo, I'm home free, and goes bam, bam. This is very important, because this is like a huge movement of energy and movement of millivolts. So at this point, we have the sodium channels are open but closing, and the potassium channels are closed, getting ready to open. So this part right here is called depolarization. So polar like I was talking about before, just means that it has a negative charge to it. And so when we're getting farther away from the negative charge, then we're becoming depolarized. And then at this point, the sodium channels are starting to close because we need to get back to this negative, and the potassium channels are opening back up. This is very important because we need to be able to stop an action from happening. And then this is called repolarization. So it's going back to the polarity that it was before, and that's what we need. However, it doesn't just stop at the resting membrane potential we want it to. It goes a little bit lower and then back up to normally. This is what we call being hyperpolarized. And this is when both the sodium channels and the sodium leakage gates things are both open, not sodium, potassium. This is when the potassium channels are open, and same with the leak channels are open. So it's becoming too negative, but then again, those sodium and potassium pumps return it back to where it was. So bam, we're chill. So at this point, when it comes back to normal, all the voltage gated potassium pumps are closed. They are only open, well, in this case, they're only open for repolarization. So when you need to get back to your normal resting membrane potential, then they need to be closed. This section right here of depolarization and repolarization, we call this the absolute refractory period. And then this point, from this point, the hyperpolarization, we call that the relative refractory period. Yeah. Lastly, I want to talk about the difference between graded potentials and action potentials, because the potential, like when you add the potentials, it's just telling you that the millivolts are changing and particles are moving, but graded and action are different. So graded, we talked a lot about this in class, and so I'm just going to use that example. This is a little axon. This is a little body, little dendrites and everything. And then, actually, let me make this a little bit shorter. These are little things reaching out, and then here's another one. And so this guy, he has all these little vesicles, full of all the little things. And so when we move particles of a charged substance inside a certain area, just that, not necessarily isolated, but that one area is going to have a change in charge, not this whole cell. So like if one of these vesicles like released its little stuff and it entered into here, it's not like all of a sudden this whole neuron like changes its charge. Like that's just not how it works. So the change just in like this area, sorry, is called a graded potential. And so like this is important, and it's not like anything bad is happening, that's just what it's called. An action potential, however, is when you have the little sodium channels, the voltage gated channels. They open up, they send positives in this area, and then it goes, and then another one is here, and then it adds more positives, and it goes, so these are length constants. I'll get to that in a second. But that's the difference between the action potentials, which move this like along a long area, and the graded potentials, which is just this isolated area. Action potentials are also a all or nothing event, like I was talking about earlier. However, graded potentials don't need necessarily a certain charge in order to work, because they're not like moving per se. Yeah. Oh, this could be any type of polarizing. Like it can be hyper or de or repolarizing, but this is also depolarizing followed by repolarizing, and then depending on the circumstances, maybe hyperpolarizing and then returning back to normal. And so this will always follow that same event, but graded potentials don't always follow that. Okay, but again with the the axon, and action potentials, I'm going to talk about two more, what's the word I'm looking for? Two more equations, and then I'll talk about how myelin affects this equation. And so I'm going to leave this picture up because I need it for myelin. But we have something called capacitance. Capacitance is super important because it describes how many charges a certain amount of millivolts can separate depending on resistance. And I will explain with a picture. I think this concept makes sense to me, but if it doesn't, not bad. And so it's Q over V. V, Q being the amount of charges, and then V being millivolts. And so if we're talking about, if we're just talking about axons again, axons are usually myelated. So they have these Schwann cells around them, unless they're in the central nervous system, then they're oligodendrocytes. But these guys just create distance, they're insulators. So they create distance between the edge of the cell and then like inside the cell, obviously. And so there's a certain amount of charges here. So your body only has the ability to separate so many charges at once. But when it's insulated like this, then the charges are more spread out. And so they can't separate as much charges with the same amount of energy. So if this is like a regular, like an unmyelinated nerve, you could have like 4 positive charges and 4 negative charges with the negative 70 millivolts. Oops. But when you myelate that area, for example, you could only separate like 2 positive charges with the same amount of voltage. So that's capacitance. So this has a lower capacitance, so a lower ability to separate charges with the same amount of energy than this one. But this, specifically the myelin, increases the length constant of the action potentials that we want. And so the length constant is whatever that sign is, equals Rm over Ri, and we square root that bad boy. And so this is the resistance to these charges, and this is just how much of that stuff is inside. And so the myelated neurons are going to have a higher length constant, but a lower capacitance. But then unmyelated nerves are going to have a higher capacitance, but a lower length constant. And so they'll need more energy and more action potentials in order to send the same messages that a myelated neuron would. And so that's why it's important to have myelation. But also, this is just like a mathematical way to describe what's happening. Did I sound smart?
Mm-hmm.